March 8, 2009, the vibrant red plug logo that once defined American weekends was being violently stripped from a massive superstore in Richmond, Virginia. Inside, veteran salespeople hugged each other tightly, weeping as liquidators hauled away the final metal shelving racks for pennies on the dollar. Just a decade earlier, Circuit City was the undisputed king of consumer electronics. With over 1,500 locations and $12 billion in revenue, it was the gold standard, the place where generations of Americans marveled at their first flat-screen TVs and tested out new stereos under the guidance of highly trained experts. But now the showrooms that once buzzed with the hum of cutting-edge technology lay completely barren. The iconic red-carpeted floors were replaced by a cold, haunting emptiness, littered with discarded price tags and faded "Everything must go" banners. How did a retail titan, so dominant that it essentially taught the nation how to buy electronics, fall so violently from grace? How did an empire that seemingly did everything right suddenly find itself hollowed out, leaving behind nothing but ghost stores? The answer is not simply a tale of a changing market or online competition. It is a much darker tragedy of corporate hubris, fatal technological bets, and the devastating cost of stripping away the human heart of a business. This is the rise and fall of Circuit City. In 1949, America was in the midst of a profound transformation. The smoke of the Second World War had cleared, giving way to an era of unprecedented prosperity. The middle class was exploding. Sprawling suburbs were cropping up almost overnight, and freshly built homes hungered for the modern marvels of a new age. Among these marvels was an invention poised to fundamentally alter how society entertained itself, consumed information, and connected with the wider world. The television set. At that time, television was still a novel kind of magic. Most Americans had never owned one, yet the desire to bring the moving picture into the living room was spreading like wildfire. Recognizing this golden opportunity, an astute businessman named Samuel Wurtzel experienced a twist of fate while vacationing with his family in Richmond, Virginia. Sitting in a local barbershop, he overheard the barber excitedly discussing the impending launch of the very first television station in the South, right there in Richmond. For most, it was merely idle chatter to pass the time. For Wurtzel, it was the clarion call of a lifetime. He understood instantly that the moment the broadcast tower went live, thousands of families would scramble to purchase their very first TV sets. Without hesitation, Wurtzel uprooted his life, relocated his family to Richmond, and opened a modest retail storefront. He named it the Ward's Company. There was no grandiose meaning behind the title. It was simply an acronym formed from the first letters of his family members' names: Wurtzel, Alan, Ruth, David, and Samuel. It was a humble, distinctly family-oriented genesis, bearing no resemblance to the multi-billion-dollar retail juggernaut that would one day roar across the American landscape. The original Ward's Company did not sell smartphones, laptops, or digital gadgets. Those belonged to a distant, unimaginable future. They sold early, bulky television consoles, radios, and essential household appliances. The interior was cramped, with inventory lined up shoulder to shoulder on simple wooden floors. Yet Wurtzel possessed a secret weapon that would allow him to outmaneuver much larger competitors: a profound understanding of consumer psychology. He recognized that purchasing a television in 1949 was a monumental investment for a middle-class household. It was not a casual transaction. It was a major financial decision that demanded absolute trust in the merchant. As the 1950s dawned, the retail battlefield grew fierce. Bustling, glamorous department stores began stocking televisions alongside clothing and furniture, threatening to crush specialized mom-and-pop operations. The Ward's Company faced an existential pressure: how to convince cautious buyers to choose a small storefront over a magnificent downtown emporium. Wurtzel's solution was rooted in service and absolute expertise. While a department store clerk might sell a television with the same superficial knowledge used to sell a sofa, Wurtzel's staff were trained to be genuine technicians. They could demystify the intricacies of primitive antennas, explain screen resolution, and instruct families on how to fine-tune the chaotic static into a clear broadcast. Knowledge that consumers desperately craved but entirely lacked. Furthermore, Wurtzel pioneered the concept of in-home demonstrations. He allowed customers to take an expensive console, place it directly in their living rooms, and experience the magic of moving pictures before fully committing their hard-earned dollars. This was backed by an ironclad promise of dedicated repair services. This philosophy of placing consumer peace of mind at the forefront was the bedrock of their survival and subsequent triumph. By the end of the decade, Samuel Wurtzel's strategy had proven spectacularly effective. Television sales skyrocketed nationwide, and the Wards Company established an unshakable foothold in Virginia. By 1959, the company was primed for a quantum leap, initiating an initial public offering to generate capital for a far grander ambition. Their vision was no longer confined to small, family-run storefronts. America was changing. The interstate highway system was redrawing the commercial map, and the concept of massive shopping centers was taking root. The seed known as the Wards Company had planted itself firmly in the soil of the American consumer economy. But to truly become an empire, they would need a new identity, an unprecedented business model, and a symbol powerful enough to burn itself into the cultural consciousness of the nation. By the 1970s, the American retail landscape was undergoing a seismic shift. The humble neighborhood appliance stores that had defined the post-war era were rapidly becoming obsolete. The consumer electronics market was exploding into a golden age of innovation, transitioning from basic black and white televisions to a dazzling array of sophisticated gadgets. Color TVs, high-fidelity stereo systems, massive wooden console record players, and the revolutionary video cassette recorder, VCR, were suddenly flooding the market. For the Wards Company, this technological renaissance presented a critical logistical problem. Their small, traditional storefronts simply could not physically hold the sheer volume and variety of the new merchandise. The mandate for change fell to Alan Wurtzel, who had taken the reins of the company from his father, Samuel. Alan recognized that the future of electronics retail could not be contained within the modest walls of downtown shops. The American consumer wanted choices, dozens of them, displayed side by side. To meet this demand, Alan envisioned a radical departure from the norm. He imagined colossal retail spaces, cavernous warehouses disguised as showrooms, where thousands of products could be housed under a single sprawling roof. It was the genesis of the superstore, a big box concept that was highly theoretical and terrifyingly expensive at the time. In 1974, the company boldly opened its first electronic superstore, spending an astronomical sum to stock it with unparalleled inventory. The experiment was an immediate, staggering success. The massive floor space allowed them to buy in unprecedented bulk, driving down prices while offering a selection that local competitors could not fathom, let alone match. Realizing that they had unlocked the definitive blueprint for the future, the company began a relentless expansion. However, a revolutionary business model required an equally revolutionary identity. The Wards Company sounded like an outdated relic of the 1950s. They needed a name that pulsed with energy, modernity, and scale. In 1984, the company officially rebranded as Circuit City. With the new name came a physical transformation that would forever alter the visual landscape of American highways and suburban strip malls. Circuit City introduced an architectural design that was as audacious as it was brilliant, the iconic red plug. The storefronts were designed with a massive, stylized red plug integrated right into the entrance, visually plugging the building into the ground. It was architectural marketing at its absolute finest. As families drove down the interstate at 60 miles per hour, they didn't need to read a sign to know what store they were passing. The glowing crimson plug was a beacon, instantly communicating power, technology, and endless possibilities. Walking through the doors of a Circuit City superstore in the 1980s was designed to be an event, a sensory overload carefully orchestrated to inspire awe. Customers were immediately greeted by the trademark red carpeted floors, giving the vast warehouse-sized space an unexpected touch of premium elegance. The showroom was a technological cathedral. There were entire walls constructed of glowing televisions all tuned to the same channel, creating a mesmerizing mosaic of moving light. Deep within the store were soundproofed audio rooms, where audiophiles could sit on leather couches and test out towering stereo systems at maximum volume without disturbing the rest of the floor. Yet the true engine of Circuit City's dominance was not the architecture or the inventory. It was the human element. The company deployed a highly aggressive, commission-based sales model. A Circuit City salesman was not a minimum-wage teenager hired to point at boxes. They were highly trained, intensely competitive electronics evangelists. Dressed impeccably, often in suits and ties, they underwent rigorous corporate training programs to master the specifications of every single item on the floor. For the average consumer in the 1980s, technology was becoming increasingly intimidating. The jargon of watts, inputs, formats, and resolutions was overwhelming. The Circuit City salesperson acted as a trusted Sherpa through this mountain of confusion. Because their livelihoods depended entirely on commission, they were deeply motivated to engage with every customer, explain the nuances of a premium VCR, and close the sale. While some critics viewed the commission floor as a high-pressure environment, the results were undeniable. Customers walked away feeling educated and confident in their expensive purchases. Executing this big-box strategy was a gamble of unprecedented scale. Constructing 40,000 square foot stores and filling them with millions of dollars of rapidly depreciating inventory required a massive accumulation of debt and an ironclad belief that the American appetite for electronics would only grow. If the inventory sat idle, the sheer overhead of maintaining the superstores and paying the elite sales force would bankrupt the company in a matter of months. But the inventory did not sit idle. As the decade progressed, America's hunger for home entertainment skyrocketed, and Circuit City was perfectly positioned to feed it. The bold bet on the red plug and the commissioned expert had paid off spectacularly, propelling the company out of its regional roots and into the stratosphere. The foundation was laid, the empire was built, and Circuit City was about to enter a golden era of dominance so absolute that it would ultimately sow the seeds of its own destruction. The dawn of the 1990s marked the absolute zenith of Circuit City's power. Having successfully deployed the red plug superstore model across the nation, the company was no longer just a retailer. It was a cultural phenomenon. For the American consumer, a weekend trip to Circuit City became a ritual. It was the destination to marvel at the newest video game consoles, to test the booming bass of towering stereo systems, and to upgrade home entertainment centers with massive, heavy tube televisions. During this golden era, the company operated with the precision and invincibility of a well-oiled machine. Wall Street adored them. The stock price was soaring, consistently outperforming almost every other retail entity on the market. They had mastered the complex logistics of moving high-ticket electronics, and their commissioned sales force was universally recognized as the most formidable in the business. Competitors looked upon the red plug empire with a mixture of envy and despair, seemingly unable to replicate the specific alchemy of vast inventory and aggressive, expert salesmanship that defined the brand. This unparalleled success, however, bred an insidious corporate mindset. When a company wins for so long and so decisively, a dangerous sense of infallibility begins to take root in the boardroom. The executives sitting at the top of the empire began to believe that their business model was practically bulletproof. This supreme confidence led them to look beyond the world of consumer electronics, searching for new industries to disrupt. In 1993, they made a wildly ambitious pivot, reasoning that selling used cars was conceptually similar to selling expensive electronics, requiring vast inventory, standardized pricing, and a guided sales process. Circuit City launched CarMax. It was a brilliant concept, designed to remove the traditional haggling and anxiety associated with used car dealerships. CarMax introduced fixed pricing, comprehensive vehicle inspections, and massive lots that offered unparalleled variety. Unsurprisingly, the venture was a massive triumph, eventually spinning off into its own fiercely successful corporation. Yet, the monumental success of CarMax disguised a fatal flaw in Circuit City's corporate strategy. Building an entirely new automotive empire demanded immense amounts of capital, executive attention, and corporate bandwidth. The brightest minds at the top were heavily focused on expanding car lots, leaving the core electronics business running on a dangerous sort of autopilot. They assumed the red plug stores would simply continue to generate massive profits indefinitely, relying on the sheer momentum of their past victories. They failed to notice that the ground beneath their core business was beginning to shift. While Circuit City was busy revolutionizing the automotive trade, a storm was gathering in the retail sector. A Midwestern competitor had been quietly studying their model, identifying every weakness, and preparing to launch a devastating counteroffensive. They did not have commission salespeople in suits. They did not have high-pressure sales tactics. What they had was a casual environment, a different store layout, and a radically different vision for how Americans wanted to shop. The era of undisputed dominance was about to end, and the first cracks in the red plug empire were slowly forming. While Circuit City's leadership was busy celebrating their automotive triumphs with CarMax and counting the massive revenues from their peak years, the consumer electronics landscape was quietly but fundamentally mutating. Best Buy, once a regional underdog, began aggressively expanding its footprint across the United States. Unlike Circuit City, which relied heavily on commissioned sales experts, guiding customers through complex, high-pressure purchases, Best Buy introduced a radically different retail philosophy, the non-commissioned, self-service superstore. Best Buy's leadership recognized a crucial shift in the cultural zeitgeist. As technology became more ubiquitous in the mid to late 1990s, consumers were becoming inherently more educated and comfortable with electronics. A teenager in 1997 didn't need a middle-aged man in a suit to explain the specifications of a Sony PlayStation or a portable CD player. They simply wanted to walk into a store, grab the colorful box off the shelf, and head to the cash register without being aggressively upsold on extended warranties and premium cables. Best Buy designed their showrooms to cater to this exact mindset. They made their stores bright, airy, and unintimidating. Crucially, they placed the actual inventory directly on the sales floor in easy-to-reach, factory-sealed boxes. At Circuit City, a customer often had to wait for a warehouse clerk to retrieve their purchase from the back room after the salesperson finalized the ticket, a process that was beginning to feel incredibly slow and outdated. At first, Circuit City's executives entirely dismissed this self-service model. Safely insulated in their Richmond headquarters, they firmly believed their commissioned staff was their ultimate, unassailable competitive advantage. They viewed Best Buy's approach as that of a cheap discount warehouse, fundamentally inferior to the premium, guided white glove experience of the red plug. This was the arrogance of success at its most lethal. Circuit City refused to see that the American consumer's preference was rapidly shifting from expert guidance to convenience, speed, and control. Furthermore, Circuit City's massive real estate portfolio, once their greatest asset, was slowly metamorphosing into a heavy burden. Many of their iconic red plug stores had been constructed in the 1970s and 1980s. These locations were often freestanding buildings, increasingly situated away from the newer, high-traffic strip malls and power centers, where Best Buy was strategically planting its massive, modern, blue and yellow storefronts. Circuit City was literally being left behind, physically isolated in aging, less desirable locations, while a younger competitor captured the fresh wave of suburban shoppers. The executives, shielded by the sheer financial volume of their past successes and distracted by the booming CarMax division, failed to react with the necessary urgency. The corporate culture, once agile and hungry, had become bloated, bureaucratic, and agonizingly slow. By the time the boardroom finally realized that Best Buy was not merely a temporary nuisance, but a terrifying existential threat, the market share gap had already widened significantly. Circuit City was no longer the undisputed king dictating the rules of the game. It was now a vulnerable, aging giant, heavily dependent on an outdated business model, fighting a desperate war against the future. The golden era had quietly slipped away, and the architecture of their impending failure was now fully, irreversibly in place. At the dawn of the new millennium, the first structural fractures in Circuit City's foundation began to show. Yet rather than reinforcing the bedrock that had supported them for decades, the corporate leadership made a catastrophic strategic decision to demolish one of their strongest pillars. In the year 2000, driven by a desperate, short-sighted desire to rebrand the company as a modernized, pure-play digital technology hub, the executives in the Richmond headquarters ordered a massive overhaul. They officially pulled the plug on the major appliance division. Overnight, they decreed that the stores would no longer sell refrigerators, washing machines, dryers, or ovens. Looking strictly at the sterile spreadsheets inside corporate boardrooms, this mandate appeared deceptively logical. Major appliances, often referred to in the industry as white goods, were colossal, cumbersome, and incredibly space-intensive. They consumed massive swaths of valuable showroom real estate and required equally massive warehousing facilities. Furthermore, the logistics of delivering and installing these heavy machines were complex and costly. Compared to the explosive growth and higher profit margins of smaller digital electronics, personal computers, and video game consoles, appliances seemed like a low-margin relic of the past. The executives argued that by evicting the appliances, they could free up thousands of square feet. This liberated space would be dedicated entirely to the sleek, high-margin gadgets of the future, transforming Circuit City into a futuristic technology destination. However, the numbers on those spreadsheets completely masked the complex reality of American consumer behavior. The executive board had critically undervalued the true strategic worth of the appliance department. They failed to understand that a washing machine was not just a product, it was an unparalleled engine for guaranteed, necessity-driven foot traffic. Purchasing a brand new, high-end television or a premium stereo system is almost always a discretionary decision. It is an aspirational purchase that depends heavily on disposable income and the overall health of the economy. If money is tight, a family can easily delay buying a larger TV. But when a refrigerator unexpectedly dies in the sweltering heat of July, or when a washing machine violently breaks down in a busy household with 3 children, it is not a choice. It is an absolute, unavoidable emergency. The customer is forced to enter a store and make a major purchase immediately, regardless of their budget or the current economic climate. For over 50 years, stretching all the way back to Samuel Wurtzel's original Ward's Company storefront, essential home appliances had served as the reliable anchor dragging consumers through the front doors. Even more crucially, appliances were the ultimate catalyst for the most effective cross-selling in the retail industry. When a stressed couple walked into a Circuit City with the sole intention of replacing a broken dishwasher, they were forced to navigate through the entire store. They would inevitably stroll past the glowing walls of televisions, hear the thumping bass of the premium audio rooms, and be mesmerized by the latest video game displays. Very often, a trip meant to replace a kitchen appliance resulted in a family leaving with a new DVD player, a camcorder, or an upgraded sound system. The appliance department fed the entire ecosystem of the store. When Circuit City severed this vital artery, the consequences were immediate, visible, and utterly devastating. The cavernous interiors of the Red Plug superstores suddenly felt disturbingly hollow. The vast empty spaces previously occupied by towering rows of refrigerators were hastily and awkwardly filled with low-ticket items like CD storage racks, basic computer cables, and miscellaneous accessories. The physical grandeur of the showroom was compromised, but more importantly, the steady, reliable stream of desperate, ready-to-buy customers evaporated overnight. Families who had spent generations relying on Circuit City to outfit their entire homes were suddenly told to take their business elsewhere. And the competition was more than happy to oblige. This monumental strategic blunder was an absolute gift to their rivals. Big box home improvement giants like Lowe's and the Home Depot aggressively expanded their own appliance showrooms, gleefully absorbing the billions of dollars in market share that Circuit City had just voluntarily thrown out the window. Worse still, Best Buy, Circuit City's most dangerous and direct adversary, seized the opportunity to further erode the Red Plug's dominance. Best Buy expanded their appliance offerings, smiling as they welcomed the exact demographic of loyal, high-spending homeowners that Circuit City had so arrogantly discarded. The fallout from this fatal exit extended far beyond lost foot traffic. It severely poisoned the internal culture of the company. Circuit City's legendary commission sales force had long relied on the steady high-dollar transactions of major appliances to sustain their livelihoods. While a TV might be a luxury, They knew they could always count on selling refrigerators to pay their mortgages. When the appliances vanished, the salespeople watched in horror as a massive portion of their income disappeared into thin air. Fear, resentment, and instability began to infect the sales floor. The very heart of the company, its expert staff, was left demoralized and financially vulnerable. The decision to abandon appliances was not merely a pivot, it was a betrayal of the company's foundational identity. It stripped away their strongest defensive moat, leaving the empire entirely exposed to the volatile, unforgiving fluctuations of the pure entertainment electronics market. It was the first truly fatal, self-inflicted wound, setting the stage for a spectacular collapse. In the late 1990s, the home entertainment industry stood on the precipice of a sweeping, irreversible revolution. The era of the bulky VHS tape, with its degrading magnetic ribbon, blurry picture quality, and agonizing rewind times, was coming to a definitive end. The technological world was preparing to embrace a new, brilliant, and razor-sharp standard, the DVD or digital video disc. For any consumer electronics retailer, this monumental format shift should have represented an endless goldmine. A completely new media format meant that millions of Americans would soon need to replace not only their movie collections, but also the hardware required to play them. All Circuit City had to do was fill their massive showrooms with these new, sleek DVD players and wait for the inevitable flood of eager customers. But within the executive suites in Richmond, a dangerous strain of corporate hubris had taken root. Blinded by their past triumphs and the meteoric rise of their CarMax spinoff, the leadership at Circuit City was no longer satisfied with merely being a middleman, distributing other companies' hardware. They did not just want to sell the future. They wanted to own it. They wanted to control the very format of the media, monopolizing the revenue stream of American living rooms. From this insatiable desire for total market control, one of the most spectacular and self-destructive technological blunders in retail history was born: DIVX. Short for Digital Video Express, DIVX was developed in partnership with a prominent Los Angeles entertainment law firm. To the untrained eye, a DIVX disc looked exactly like a standard DVD, but it harbored a deeply restrictive, proprietary heart. The business model was pitched as a revolutionary hybrid of a retail purchase and a video rental. Instead of paying $20 to buy a movie and own it forever, a customer could purchase a DVX disc for roughly $4.50. However, that deeply discounted price came with a draconian catch. The very second the disc was inserted into a specialized DivX player, an invisible digital countdown clock began to tick. The consumer had exactly 48 hours to watch the film. Once that window closed, the disc was digitally locked. If a customer wanted to watch that same movie again a week or a month later, they could not simply press play. The DIVX player was required to be physically connected to the home's landline telephone. The machine would literally dial out to a centralized Circuit City server, report the viewing data, and automatically charge the customer's credit card an additional fee to unlock the disc for another 48 hours. Essentially, Circuit City was attempting to install an automated toll booth inside the living rooms of its customers, continuously extracting money for a physical object the customer already held in their hands. The arrogance of the Red Plug empire was so vast that they genuinely believed their sheer market dominance could force both Hollywood studios and the American public to submit to their proprietary system. During the initial months of the DVD format war, Circuit City heavily suppressed the sale of open-format DVD players manufactured by giants like Sony and Toshiba. When excited customers walked into a Circuit City store looking for the standard DVD technology they had read about in magazines, the commissioned sales staff were pressured to aggressively steer them toward the restrictive DVX machines instead. However, the executives fundamentally underestimated the intelligence, pride, and influence of the core demographic, the tech enthusiasts. These early adopters, the very people who dictate the success or failure of any new technological standard, instantly saw through the illusion of DivX. They were fiercely opposed to the concept of pay-per-view for physical media. They raised massive, prescient concerns regarding consumer privacy, deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a retail corporation tracking and cataloging their personal viewing habits via a phone line. They openly mocked the sheer absurdity of having to run a long, tangled telephone cord across their living room carpets just to watch a movie. Furthermore, an ecosystem that encouraged users to throw away a plastic disc after a single weekend of use triggered an immediate environmental backlash. On the nascent, text-heavy message boards of the early internet, a highly organized and incredibly vocal boycott ignited. DIVX was not just rejected, it was actively despised. While Circuit City was burning through tens of millions of dollars in desperate advertising campaigns, trying to force an unwanted and hated product onto the public, Best Buy was quietly executing a masterful countermaneuver. Best Buy openly embraced the standard, open DVD format, giving the consumers exactly what they demanded, the freedom of ownership and simplicity. The result was a massive, immediate exodus. The tech enthusiasts, the loyal, high-spending evangelists who had built Circuit City's empire in the 1980s, cut up their store credit cards and walked straight into the welcoming blue and yellow aisles of the competition. By the summer of 1999, merely a year and a half after its aggressive nationwide rollout, Circuit City was forced to raise the white flag. They officially announced the termination of the DIVX format. This catastrophic failure did not just vaporize an estimated $300 million in development and marketing capital. It inflicted a deep, permanent wound on the brand's soul. Circuit City was no longer viewed as the trusted guide to the technological future. In the eyes of the American public, they had morphed into a greedy, out-of-touch corporate monolith that had actively tried to exploit them. The millions of dollars were gone, the precious time was lost, and the shattered trust of the consumer pushed the once invincible retail king even closer to the edge of the abyss. In the early 2000s, the pressure mounting on Circuit City's walls was not solely from the relentless, aggressive expansion of Best Buy. It was increasingly generated by the crushing weight of their own internal missteps. After voluntarily relinquishing the guaranteed foot traffic of the major appliance division and incinerating hundreds of millions of dollars on the disastrous DIVX format, the profit margins of the red plug empire were wearing dangerously thin. Wall Street was losing its patience. Investors continuously demanded that the executive board take drastic measures to slash operational costs and salvage the deteriorating bottom line. In that climate of desperation, rather than innovating their retail strategy or enhancing the customer shopping experience, the corporate leadership in Richmond turned their cold gaze toward the very people who had built the empire, the expert sales force. Since the early days when Samuel Wurtzel founded the Ward's Company, the absolute soul of the brand had been anchored in customer service. Circuit City's sales force was not comprised of transient, minimum-wage teenagers working a summer job. They were highly trained, commissioned professionals possessing an encyclopedic knowledge of every electronic device on the showroom floor. Because the commission structure rewarded expertise and aggressive salesmanship, countless employees had stayed with the company for decades, building stable careers and earning exceptionally high incomes for the retail sector. Some making well over $50,000 to $60,000 a year during that era. They were the anchor that kept customers returning. They were the reason Americans trusted Circuit City with their wallets when it came time to purchase an expensive home theater system or a complex piece of technology. But to the executives staring strictly at corporate balance sheets, this elite team of experts was no longer viewed as an invaluable asset. They were classified simply as an exorbitant, unnecessary overhead cost that needed to be surgically excised. And so in 2003, one of the most ruthless and agonizingly short-sighted decisions in modern American business history was executed. The corporate headquarters issued a mandate to instantly terminate 3,400 of their highest-earning, most experienced, and most successful sales associates across the entire nationwide chain. The official rationale provided for this mass firing was not that these employees were underperforming, nor was it that they lacked dedication. They were fired quite simply because they were making too much money. The supreme tragedy of this execution was that it did not target the weak links. It explicitly punished the absolute best individuals in the company precisely because they had been too good at their jobs. On that fateful day, thousands of loyal employees, men and women who had dedicated their professional lives to mastering specification sheets, troubleshooting complex stereos, and guiding generations of families through their purchases, were pulled into back offices. They were stripped of their name tags, told to pack their belongings, and escorted out of the glowing red buildings forever. They were immediately replaced by a brand new fleet of hourly workers, paid the absolute minimum wage, offered zero commissions, and possessing virtually no specialized knowledge of consumer electronics. The consequences of this corporate bloodletting were immediate, palpable, and entirely catastrophic. The beating heart of Circuit City had officially flatlined. When consumers walked into the Red Plug superstores in the weeks following the mass termination, they were no longer greeted by confident, sharply dressed experts eager to guide them. Instead, when a customer asked about the nuanced differences between two high-end audio receivers or requested assistance designing a surround sound living room, they were met with blank stares, confused shrugs, or the hesitant, uninformed answers of brand new trainees who had just learned where the break room was. The single, defining competitive advantage that Circuit City still held over Best Buy's self-service model, the deep, personalized, expert guidance, had been voluntarily slaughtered by their own executives. Public outrage erupted across the country. Retail analysts and business journalists were absolutely stunned by the sheer naivety of the Circuit City leadership. By firing their best salespeople, the company may have successfully saved a few tens of millions of dollars on their short-term payroll ledgers, but they effectively incinerated billions of dollars in long-term revenue. Customers felt profoundly betrayed and abandoned. Without the seasoned experts there to hold their hands through the intimidating landscape of emerging technologies, there was absolutely no remaining incentive for a consumer to drive out of their way to visit a Circuit City. They could simply go to a brighter, newer Best Buy or pick up a television while buying groceries at a Walmart supercenter. The mass firing of 2003 was not merely a tragic human resources blunder, it was a fatal, self-inflicted wound that severed the last remaining cultural connection between the brand and the American consumer. The trust was entirely broken, and the legendary customer loyalty vanished overnight. From this point forward, Circuit City was no longer an empire fighting to adapt to a changing world. It was a hollowed-out shell, bleeding out on the retail battlefield, stumbling directionlessly through the final years of its life, while it waited for the perfect storm to finally wash it away. By the mid-2000s, the landscape of American retail was no longer a terrain that Circuit City dominated. Instead, the empire found itself trapped in a desperate, losing race against two formidable forces: the physical supremacy of Best Buy and the invisible, digital onslaught of Amazon. The architectural and philosophical moat that once protected the Red Plug was being drained from both sides, leaving the company exposed and increasingly irrelevant. The rivalry with Best Buy had evolved from a mere competition into a total eclipse. While Circuit City was burdened by an aging real estate portfolio, freestanding buildings constructed in the 1970s and 80s that were often isolated from modern traffic patterns, Best Buy had strategically anchored itself in the high-traffic power centers and suburban strip malls where modern families actually shopped. A trip to Best Buy was convenient. A trip to an old, standalone Circuit City felt like a trek to a decaying relic of the past. Furthermore, the customer experience at Best Buy had successfully captured the zeitgeist of the new millennium. Their blue shirts were seen as helpful peers, not high-pressure predators. The open, bright, and airy floor plans encouraged browsing and hands-on testing. In contrast, the post-2003 Circuit City floor was a hollowed-out shell. Having fired their experts, the remaining staff were often undertrained and unmotivated, yet the environment still carried the lingering, uncomfortable residue of the old high-pressure sales culture. Customers could feel the desperation in the aisles. But as the battle on the ground intensified, a much more dangerous threat was gathering in the digital ether. The rise of e-commerce, spearheaded by Amazon, began to fundamentally rewire the American consumer's brain. For decades, the big box electronics store's greatest asset was its inventory. The fact that you could see the product and take it home today. Amazon attacked this advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a tech giant that didn't have to pay for thousands of expensive retail leases or a massive floor staff. Circuit City's response to the internet was agonizingly slow and technologically primitive. Their website was often buggy, difficult to navigate, and critically disconnected from their physical stores. While Best Buy moved quickly to adopt an omni-channel strategy, pioneering the buy online, pick up in-store model that bridged the gap between digital and physical shopping, Circuit City treated the web as a secondary catalog rather than the future of the business. Their digital infrastructure was so neglected that they famously outsourced their website operations to Amazon itself for several years, essentially handing their customer data and digital keys to their primary executioner. This led to the devastating phenomenon known as showrooming. Every day, thousands of consumers would walk into a Circuit City, use the store's electricity, air conditioning, and floor space to test out a high-end camera or a flat-screen TV, and then pull out their smartphones to purchase that exact item on Amazon for a 15% discount. Circuit City was providing the service, while Amazon was collecting the profit. The red plug empire was effectively subsidizing its own destruction. As 2007 approached, Circuit City was caught in a lethal pincer movement. They couldn't match Best Buy's physical appeal, and they couldn't compete with Amazon's digital prices. Their cash reserves were evaporating, and their stock price began a terrifying descent toward zero. The company was no longer a titan. It was a ghost ship, drifting into the most violent economic storm in nearly a century. The end was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The year 2008 is etched into the collective memory of the American public as a time of profound financial terror. The housing bubble burst, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the global economy plummeted into the devastating depths of the Great Recession. For healthy, agile companies, this macroeconomic tsunami was a grueling test of endurance. But for a company like Circuit City, already hollowed out by years of strategic blunders, executive arrogance, and a shattered corporate culture, it was an absolute death sentence. The empire of the red plug was already a massive ship taking on water. The financial collapse of 2008 was the hurricane that finally dragged it to the bottom of the ocean. To understand the sheer velocity of Circuit City's final collapse, one must understand the delicate, invisible lifeblood of the retail industry: credit. Big box electronics retailers do not typically pay cash up front for the millions of dollars of inventory sitting on their showroom floors. They operate on vendor credit. Giants like Sony, Samsung, Panasonic, and Hewlett-Packard ship their televisions, laptops, and home theater systems to the retailer, with the understanding that they will be paid back within a specific window, usually 30 to 60 days. This entire ecosystem requires absolute, unwavering trust in the retailer's ability to sell the merchandise and remain solvent. By the late summer of 2008, that trust had completely evaporated. As the global credit markets froze and Wall Street descended into panic, the major electronics manufacturers began to heavily scrutinize the financial health of their retail partners. When they looked at Circuit City's balance sheets, they were horrified. The retailer was burning through cash at an alarming rate, bleeding out market share month after month to Best Buy and Amazon. Fearing that Circuit City would soon default on its massive debts, the vendors made a ruthless yet highly logical business decision. They pulled the plug. One by one, the world's largest electronics suppliers began dramatically tightening their credit terms with Circuit City. Some demanded much shorter repayment windows, while others flatly refused to ship new inventory unless the retailer paid in cold, hard cash up front. For a company already struggling with a severe liquidity crisis, this was a fatal blow. Circuit City simply did not have the cash reserves required to purchase the inventory they needed to survive. The timing of this vendor panic could not have been more catastrophic. It occurred just as the retail sector was gearing up for the critical fourth quarter, the holiday shopping season. In the consumer electronics industry, the weeks between Black Friday and Christmas are a matter of life and death, often accounting for the vast majority of a company's annual profit. To survive the holidays, a retailer needs their showrooms stacked to the ceiling with the newest, most highly anticipated gadgets. Instead, as the holidays approached, Circuit City stores began to look incredibly bleak. Because they could not secure credit, they could not secure inventory. The newest models of flat-screen televisions were conspicuously missing from the glowing display walls. The latest video game consoles were out of stock. The shelves that were supposed to be overflowing with high-margin digital cameras, laptops, and GPS units were increasingly bare. Customers who walked into the stores seeking holiday gifts were met with a depressing lack of selection. Word quickly spread among consumers. Circuit City had nothing left to sell. Shoppers simply turned their cars around and headed straight to Best Buy, leaving the Red Plug superstores echoing with an eerie, hollow silence. The walls were finally closing in. Faced with empty shelves, vanishing foot traffic, and a completely frozen credit market, the executive board ran out of options. On November 10, 2008, just weeks before the most important shopping day of the year, Circuit City officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. At the time of the filing, the company's leadership attempted to project an aura of calm and control. They issued press releases assuring the public, their vendors, and their terrified employees that this was merely a strategic restructuring. Chapter 11, they argued, would give them the legal breathing room needed to renegotiate crushing lease agreements, shed toxic debt, and emerge as a leaner, more agile competitor. As part of this initial survival plan, they immediately announced the permanent closure of 155 underperforming stores and the termination of thousands of additional employees. But the corporate optimism was a mere illusion. The life support machines were beeping, but the patient was already terminal. The Chapter 11 filing only accelerated the vendor panic, completely severing whatever fragile supply chains remained. Furthermore, the very stigma of bankruptcy frightened away the last remaining loyal customers who feared buying expensive, complex electronics from a company that might not exist the following week to honor extended warranties or accept returns. Behind closed doors, executives desperately scrambled to find a buyer, a white knight investor willing to absorb the debt and save the legendary brand. Frantic negotiations were held and rumors swirled about a potential buyout from a massive Mexican retail conglomerate. But as the winter weeks dragged on, it became painfully clear that no one wanted to catch a falling knife. The brand reputation was too damaged, the real estate portfolio was too outdated, and the global economy was simply too toxic. The perfect storm had done its work. The fleeting hope of restructuring was over. The agonizing era of liquidation was about to begin. By the dawn of 2009, the fragile hope that Circuit City could successfully restructure and survive under Chapter 11 bankruptcy had completely evaporated. The holiday shopping season of 2008 had been an unmitigated disaster. With severely restricted inventory and terrified consumers holding tightly to their wallets amidst the Great Recession, the company failed to generate the vital cash flow needed to appease its creditors. Behind the scenes, the desperate scramble to find a corporate savior, a white knight willing to purchase the company and keep the brand alive, had ended in bitter failure. Potential buyers looked at the massive debt, the deeply tarnished reputation, and the collapsing global economy, and quietly walked away. On January 16, 2009, the devastating and final announcement was made. The United States Bankruptcy Court officially approved the total liquidation of Circuit City. The company would immediately close its remaining 567 locations across the country. In an instant, more than 30,000 remaining employees learned that they were not just losing a job. They were witnessing the permanent erasure of their careers, their community, and an American retail institution. The keys to the empire were handed over to a consortium of specialized liquidation firms, and the agonizing process of dismantling a 60-year-old legacy began. The atmosphere inside the Red Plug superstores shifted almost overnight. They were no longer vibrant cathedrals of technology. They had been transformed into corporate morgues. The liquidation sales were heavily advertised, drawing massive crowds of bargain hunters who descended upon the stores like vultures circling a carcass. These were not the loyal, enthusiastic tech enthusiasts of the 1990s. These were pragmatic, unsentimental shoppers looking to strip the aisles of whatever discounted merchandise they could carry. The transition was brutal. The familiar red and white signs were plastered over with garish, neon yellow and black banners screaming, "Store closing! Everything must go and nothing held back." For the thousands of employees who were asked to stay on and work through the liquidation, the final weeks were a masterclass in psychological endurance. They were essentially tasked with presiding over their own funerals. The employees had to watch as the careful merchandising standards they had upheld for years were entirely abandoned. Customers tore open boxes, scattered cables across the floor, and haggled over prices with an aggressive entitlement. Knowing full well the company had no leverage left, the liquidators dictated the terms, and the staff were merely custodians of the chaos. As the days bled into weeks, the inventory slowly dwindled. The high-ticket items, the few remaining flat-screen televisions, the gaming consoles, the premium laptops were the first to vanish. Then went the mid-tier electronics, the digital cameras and the audio receivers. Soon, the massive showrooms were reduced to selling obscure, unwanted accessories. Thousands of mismatched phone cases, obsolete software disks, and tangled bins of discounted extension cords. The vastness of the big box model, which had once projected an image of infinite abundance, now worked against them, amplifying the profound emptiness of the space. Whole sections of the store were roped off with yellow caution tape, herding the dwindling merchandise into a concentrated area near the front registers. The empire was physically shrinking, hour by hour, right before their eyes. March 8, 2009, marked the official, final day of operations for the vast majority of the Circuit City chain. On this bleak Sunday, the true harrowing reality of the collapse finally settled in. The merchandise was entirely gone. The once glorious showrooms had been picked completely clean of consumer electronics. What remained was the raw, unglamorous skeleton of the retail business. The liquidators began selling off the very fixtures that held the store together. Everything was slapped with a price tag: the sturdy metal shelving units, the glass display cases, the breakroom refrigerators, the employee lockers, and even the shopping carts were sold for pennies on the dollar to local small business owners. The iconic glowing red signage that hung above the customer service desks was unceremoniously unbolted and hauled away. The architecture itself was being cannibalized. For the veteran employees, those who had survived the brutal 2003 purges and stayed fiercely loyal to the bitter end, this final day was overwhelmingly emotional. Many of them had spent their entire adult lives walking on those red-carpeted floors. They had met their spouses there, celebrated life milestones in the break rooms, and built a profound camaraderie forged in the fires of holiday retail rushes. Now they stood in small, quiet circles near the front doors, wearing their familiar red polo shirts one last time, weeping as they hugged each other goodbye. There was a haunting, heavy silence that descended upon the stores on that final afternoon. The ambient hum of hundreds of televisions, the thumping bass from the audio rooms, and the chaotic chatter of weekend shoppers, the lifeblood soundtrack of Circuit City, had been completely extinguished. Without the merchandise and the massive crowds to dampen the acoustics, every footstep echoed loudly across the barren, scuffed linoleum floors. The scale of the emptiness was terrifying. It was the physical manifestation of failure, a vast void where a multi-billion-dollar enterprise used to be. As the clock struck the final hour, the store managers walked to the front entrances and performed the somber ritual of locking the heavy glass doors for the last time. The lights were systematically switched off, plunging the massive warehouses into a permanent, ghostly darkness. Outside, work crews and cherry pickers were already arriving to physically rip the massive red plug logos off the exterior facades, leaving behind faded, dirty outlines on the brickwork. Architectural scars that would linger in suburban strip malls for years to come. The collapse of Circuit City was total and absolute. In a matter of weeks, an empire that had employed over 40,000 people, generated $12 billion in annual revenue, and essentially taught the United States how to buy modern electronics was simply wiped from the map. It was not absorbed by a competitor, nor was it rebranded under a different corporate umbrella. It was utterly dissolved. The doors were locked, the parking lots emptied, and the once mighty giant faded into a silent, cautionary tale of retail history. The year 2009 concluded with the physical erasure of over 500 Circuit City locations across the United States. Yet, in the world of retail, iconic brands rarely die a clean death. They are often auctioned off as hollow relics of their former selves. The brand name, the trademark red plug logo, and the massive customer database were eventually purchased by Systemax for a mere $14 million. Systemax attempted to revive Circuit City as a pure-play e-commerce platform, hoping the familiar name still held enough residual gravity to attract online shoppers. However, this digital resurrection was a pale shadow of the original empire. It lacked the massive showrooms, the glowing walls of televisions, and most importantly, the human heartbeat of the business. Without the expert guidance that once defined the brand, the website was just another generic electronics portal lost in the vastness of the internet. By 2012, Systemax abandoned the effort, and while the brand has been traded between different owners since then, it has never recaptured its lost glory. The collapse of Circuit City leaves behind a classic and chilling cautionary tale for the modern business world. It is a masterclass in the perils of corporate hubris. When a company begins to believe that its historical success is a shield against future disruption, it effectively starts digging its own grave. The leadership was arrogant enough to believe they could force a restrictive format like DivX onto a resistant public, and blind enough to discard their core appliance business for the sake of short-term spreadsheet gains. But the most devastating lesson, the fatal blow that truly killed the red plug, was the systematic destruction of the human connection. When Circuit City fired its 3,400 most experienced experts in 2003 just to save on payroll, they didn't just lose employees. They threw away the only reason for a customer to walk through their doors. In an age where Best Buy offered convenience and Amazon offered unbeatable prices, the only thing Circuit City had left to sell was trust and expertise. By liquidating their people, they effectively liquidated their future. Today, if you drive through suburban shopping centers across America, you can still find the lingering ghosts of this vanished empire. You will see massive buildings with strangely shaped facades where the red plug once hung, now repurposed into gyms, discount grocery stores, or sitting entirely vacant with weeds pushing through the cracked asphalt of the parking lots. They stand as silent, haunting monuments to a brutal reality. In the world of retail, no empire is too large to fail. And the moment you stop valuing your people and your customers, the clock starts ticking toward your inevitable silence. The story of Circuit City is often reduced to a simple business case study about the perils of bad management and the ruthless efficiency of online competition. But for the millions of Americans who grew up wandering those red-carpeted aisles, the loss means something far more profound. It is a stark reminder that even the most seemingly invincible empires, the ones that literally defined how a nation shopped, learned, and entertained itself, can vanish entirely if they lose their soul. Circuit City did not die because people stopped buying electronics. They died because their corporate leadership became blinded by their own historical success. They arrogantly believed that their past victories would automatically protect their future. In their desperate, short-sighted pursuit of higher profit margins, they severed their connection with the very people who built their empire, their expert salespeople, and their loyal everyday customers. When the iconic glowing red plug signs were finally torn down from the facades, it wasn't just a multi-billion-dollar retailer going bankrupt. It was the absolute erasure of a distinct era of American consumer culture. It was the end of a time when buying a television or a stereo was an event, an experience guided by a trusted human expert rather than a cold algorithmic recommendation on a screen. Today, the massive buildings that once housed the magic of the future sit repurposed or abandoned, their architectural scars still faintly visible on brick walls in suburban strip malls across the country. They stand as silent, haunting monuments to the brutal reality of the retail world. A business lives by its ability to adapt, but it dies the very moment it forgets its own heart. If you remember the mesmerizing hum of the television walls, the thrill of browsing the music aisles, or the guidance of a red-shirted Circuit City expert, share your memories in the comments below. What was that one special item you bought there that you still remember today? Thank you for watching. If you want to explore more stories of the forgotten empires and vanished brands that once shaped our world, please subscribe and join us for the next documentary.